Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Sunday, July 13th, 2025, and you're listening to Alex's News. The weather in Riverside will reach a high of 90.0 degrees Fahrenheit today, with a low of 64.9. It's a warm day, so remember to stay cool and hydrated if you are spending time outdoors. Coming up, we will examine the motivations behind a recent tariff announcement from Donald Trump and what this could mean. Then, we will delve into the reasons why federal immigration agents are now operating under new limitations. All this and more coming up on Alex's News. Stay tuned. We begin this morning with a significant economic tremor felt across global markets. Former U.S. President Donald Trump has unveiled a new round of substantial tariffs, specifically targeting goods from the European Union and Mexico. Joining us this morning to break down these new developments and their potential impact is our economic reporter, Ethan. Ethan, this is quite the announcement. What exactly has been laid out?
Grace, it certainly is a dramatic move. As of yesterday, July 12, 2025, former President Trump announced the imposition of new 30% tariffs on goods imported from both the European Union and Mexico. This announcement, according to reporting from National Public Radio CNBC and CBS News, was made via letters posted to his social media account, Truth Social, from Bridgewater, New Jersey. These tariffs are scheduled to commence very soon, specifically on August 1, 2025, which is just 19 days from now.
So a uniform 30% rate for both the EU and Mexico. But is this an isolated incident or part of a larger strategy?
It is absolutely part of a much broader strategy, Grace. This 30% tariff rate applies uniformly, as you noted, to both the EU and Mexico. But this announcement, according to CBS News and AlJazeera.com, is part of what they term an, quote, announcement blitz of new tariffs, end quote. We've seen him issue similar tariff conditions to 24 other countries and the entire 27-member European Union. In fact, earlier this week, he threatened a 35% tariff against Canada and a 50% rate for Brazil, as National Public Radio has reported. It follows a previous, quote, Liberation Day, end quote, tariff announcement on April 2nd, which imposed a nearly global 10% tariff and higher duties on almost 60 countries, causing what CNBC described as, quote, frenzied selling, end quote, in global markets. There was a 90-day pause on those higher tariffs, which was extended until August 1st, the very same date these new tariffs are set to kick in. And it's worth noting that the 30% tariff on the EU is notably steeper than the 20% tax Trump had unveiled in April, according to AlJazeera.com.
Quite the escalation. So what justifications has former President Trump offered for these tariffs, particularly concerning Mexico and the European Union?
Well, Grace, Trump has framed these tariffs as a means to revive a U.S. economy he claims has been exploited by other nations. According to National Public Radio and CBS News, his actions are aimed at establishing a more, quote, reciprocal, end quote, global trade landscape. For Mexico, he acknowledged their efforts in stemming undocumented migrants and fentanyl, but asserted it was, quote, not enough, end quote, to prevent North America from becoming a, quote, narco-trafficking playground, end quote, as reported by National Public Radio and CBS News. He also hinted that tariffs could be adjusted if Mexico successfully curbs cartel activities and fentanyl flow, or if Mexico opts to build and manufacture products within the United States.
And what about the EU? What's his reasoning there?
For the European Union, he declared the U.S. trade deficit a national security threat. He criticized the EU's, quote, tariff and non-tariff policies and trade barriers, end quote, for creating, quote, long-term, large, and persistent trade deficits, end quote, and an, quote, unreciprocal, end quote, relationship. This has been widely reported by National Public Radio, CBS News, and AlJazeera.com. He even offered to waive tariffs on EU goods if companies within the bloc decide to build or manufacture products within the United States. And he warned that if the EU or Mexico retaliate with higher tariffs, the U.S. would add an equivalent percentage on top of the 30% U.S. charge, according to CNBC and AlJazeera.com. It seems he's trying to hit a home run with these tariffs, but it could lead to some trade strikeouts.
A quote trade security end quote claim then. How significant are the EU and Mexico as trading partners for the U.S., and how do these tariff figures compare to typical trade patterns?
They are incredibly significant, Grace. The EU and Mexico combined account for roughly 1/3 of total U.S. imports, as CNBC points out. In 2022, U.S. goods imports from the EU topped $553 billion, and from Mexico, approximately $454.8 billion. Historically, U.S. and EU tariffs on each other's goods averaged around 1.35 to 1.47%, making a 30% tariff quite a leap. While the U.S. has a goods trade deficit with the EU, some analyses, including those cited by conversibleeconomist.com, suggest that when both goods and services are considered, the overall transatlantic trade can be considered, quote, relatively balanced, end quote, or even, quote, near balance, end quote. This comprehensive view challenges Trump's characterization of the relationship as, quote, far from reciprocal, end quote.
So what have been the initial reactions from the EU and Mexico to these proposed tariffs?
Reactions have been swift and quite firm. European Union Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, according to National Public Radio and CBS News, affirmed the bloc's, quote, commitment to dialogue, end quote, but warned that imposing such tariffs would, quote, disrupt essential transatlantic supply chains, end quote, and harm businesses, consumers, and patients on both sides of the Atlantic. She stated they are ready to work towards an agreement by August 1st, but, quote, will take all necessary steps to safeguard EU interests, including the adoption of proportionate countermeasures if required, end quote. This suggests they are not just going to take this lying down.
And Mexico?
Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum confirmed her government was informed of these new tariffs during a meeting in Washington, D.C., yesterday, July 11th. Mexico's economy and foreign ministries called the deal, quote, unfair treatment, end quote, and expressed disagreement with the decision, as CNBC and CBS News have reported. Sheinbaum asserted that the sovereignty of the Mexican people is, quote, non-negotiable, end quote, and they are seeking an agreement to prevent the tariffs. They've also indicated plans for retaliatory measures, including tariff and non-tariff measures, in defense of their interests. It seems both sides are digging in their heels, making for a potentially prickly trade situation.
This really does seem like it could blow up the established rules of world trade. What are the broader implications, and what do experts say about who ultimately bears the cost of these tariffs?
You're right, Grace. As National Public Radio and CBS News have pointed out, this announcement effectively, quote, blows up the rules governing world trade, end quote. Experts largely agree that such tariffs primarily function as, quote, taxes he's going to levy on his citizens, end quote, as Douglas Holtz-Eakin, former Congressional Budget Office Director, told National Public Radio. He and other economists, like those at Yale, consistently warn that tariffs are, quote, inflationary, end quote, and will lead to rising costs for U.S. consumers and businesses. Projections for 2025 tariffs estimate a potential 1.7% increase in consumer prices in the short run, equivalent to an average income loss of $2,300 per household, disproportionately impacting lower-income households. Think of it. Projected short-run price increases of 37% for shoes and 35% for apparel. These tariffs are no Cinderella story for American wallets.
So it's the consumers who pay more, not the foreign producers?
Exactly. Historical data, such as the 2018 to 2019 tariffs, show these costs were fully and quickly passed through to consumer goods prices within 2 months. Furthermore, tariffs reduce U.S. export competitiveness due to retaliatory measures from trade partners. When the U.S. imposes tariffs, trading partners often retaliate with their own tariffs on U.S. exports, making American goods more expensive and less competitive abroad. As of April 2025, China, Canada, and the European Union have announced or imposed retaliatory tariffs affecting hundreds of billions of dollars of U.S. exports, according to the Tax Foundation. And beyond costs, they disrupt existing supply chains, leading to higher product pricing and potentially leaner selections or shortages on store shelves, as experts like Guram Gopal from the Illinois Institute of Technology suggest.
And finally, Ethan, what legal and diplomatic avenues might the EU and Mexico pursue in response?
Both the EU and Mexico are members of the World Trade Organization, or WTO, and could utilize its dispute settlement mechanism. They could request consultations with the U.S., potentially leading to a panel establishment if negotiations fail. The tariffs would likely be challenged on grounds of violating the most favored nation principle, which means treating all trading partners equally and potentially exceeding bound tariff rates. However, a complicating factor is that the WTO's appellate body has been non-functional since December 2019, weakening the enforceability of any favorable WTO ruling. Beyond that, the EU has its anti-coercion instrument, which allows it to take action against economic coercion. Mexico, too, could consider retaliatory tariffs, or argue the tariffs violate the USMCA agreement. Despite these legal mechanisms, both the EU and Mexico are prioritizing diplomatic negotiations to find mutually beneficial solutions and avoid a full-blown trade war. It's a very delicate dance.
Indeed. Ethan, thank you for breaking down this complex and potentially disruptive development. We'll certainly be keeping a close eye on this in the coming weeks.
My pleasure, Grace.
That was Ethan with the latest on former President Trump's new tariff announcements. Stay with us. When we come back, we have another story. Welcome back to our morning news segment. We have a crucial update on a significant legal development unfolding in Southern California, impacting immigration enforcement. Joining us with the details is our reporter, Chloe. Chloe, this is story 2 of 2 for us this morning. What can you tell us about this new federal court order?
Grace, it's certainly a development that has sent ripples, if not waves, across the region. Just 2 days ago, on July 11, 2025, U.S. District Judge Mame Iwusi Mensah Frimpong, who is a President Biden appointee, issued a temporary restraining order. This order has immediately halted federal immigration agents from conducting indiscriminate stops and arrests in 7 Southern California counties. According to reporting from the Los Angeles Times, BBC News, and Anchorage Daily News, the ruling specifically prohibits agents from using racial profiling and other unconstitutional tactics as the basis for detaining individuals.
So this isn't just about general enforcement, but specifically how agents are conducting these stops. What did Judge Frimpong's, quote, searing ruling, end quote, find that led to this decision?
Exactly, Grace. The judge found what she called, quote, sufficient evidence, end quote, and even a, quote, mountain of evidence, end quote, that federal agents were relying on factors like race, speaking Spanish or English with an accent, a person's job such as being a day laborer, or their presence at specific locations like Home Depots, car washes, and swap meets to form what they called, quote, reasonable suspicion, end quote, for detention. She determined these factors are, quote, insufficient and impermissible, end quote, as the sole or primary basis for stops, stating they are, quote, no more indicative of illegal presence in the country than of legal presence, end quote. This is a key point, Grace. The judge found these practices violate the 4th and 5th Amendments of the U.S. Constitution, which protect against unreasonable searches and seizures and ensure due process, respectively. This information comes from the Los Angeles Times, BBC News, and Anchorage Daily News.
That's quite a strong finding. Beyond the stops themselves, I understand the order also addresses conditions at a downtown Los Angeles detention facility, B18. What exactly is being mandated there?
That's right, Grace. Judge Frimpong also mandated that all individuals held at B18 must be given 24-hour access to lawyers and a confidential phone line. This directive came after immigrant advocacy groups, including the Immigrant Defenders Law Center, alleged that lawyers had been denied access since June, and detainees lacked sufficient phone access or information about available lawyers. There were also reports of, quote, deplorable, end quote, dungeon-like, end quote, conditions at B-18, including a lack of adequate food and beds. Advocates argued these conditions could coerce detainees into signing deportation papers. The judge's order requires B-18 to be open to attorney visitation 7 days a week, for at least 8 hours on weekdays and 4 hours on weekends, with free phone access. This is per reports from the Los Angeles Times, Anchorage Daily News, BGOV.com, and Eclusical.org.
It sounds like a significant victory for immigrant rights advocates. Who exactly filed this lawsuit that led to the temporary restraining order?
The lawsuit was filed by a coalition of groups, GRACE, including the American Civil Liberties Union, Public Counsel, other immigrant rights organizations, and private attorneys. They represented several immigrant rights groups, 3 immigrants who were picked up at a Pasadena bus stop while seeking work, and 2 U.S. citizens. One U.S. citizen, Brian Gavidia, was reportedly held despite showing identification. The plaintiffs argued that federal agents did not identify themselves, made unlawful warrantless arrests, and held people in deplorable conditions without legal access, violating constitutional rights. Mohammed Tajzar from the ACLU asserted that such government actions constitute illegal discrimination, citing instances where federal agents allegedly grabbed anyone who, quote, looked Hispanic, end quote. This information comes from the Los Angeles Times, BBC News, and Anchorage Daily News.
Chloe, this order comes at a particularly fraught time, doesn't it? We've heard about intensified immigration sweeps recently.
Absolutely, Grace. This judicial intervention comes amidst intensified immigration sweeps by the Trump administration in California, which advocates claim have, quote, terrorized Angelenos, forced people into hiding and damaged the local economy, end quote. According to the Los Angeles Times, since June 6th, federal agents have reportedly arrested nearly 2,800 undocumented individuals. A Los Angeles Times analysis of early June arrests found that 69% had no criminal conviction and 58% had never been charged. The Trump administration has explicitly aimed to meet a daily quota of 3,000 arrests as part of what President Trump has called the, quote, largest deportation, end quote, campaign in U.S. history, as reported by the BBC News. This order followed a particularly high-tension moment, including a large worksite enforcement raid just yesterday, July 10, 2025, where approximately 200 suspected undocumented immigrants were arrested at 2 cannabis operations in Ventura County. During that raid, a man fell 30 feet from a greenhouse roof, sustaining grave injuries, and the FBI is investigating whether shots were fired at federal agents during a protest, according to the Los Angeles Times and BBC News. Talk about a pressure cooker situation.
Indeed. With such a strong stance from the judge and the ongoing efforts by the administration, how have reactions to Judge Frimpong's ruling been divided?
Grace, the reactions are about as opposite as they can get. California Democrats, including Governor Gavin Newsom and Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass, widely hailed the decision as a victory for justice and the Constitution. Mayor Bass stated that Los Angeles has been, quote, under assault, end quote, by the administration, while Governor Newsom declared that, quote, justice prevailed today, end quote, putting a temporary halt to federal officials, quote, violating people's rights and racial profiling, end quote. This is according to the Los Angeles Times and CBSNews.com.
And from the Trump administration, what was their response to this perceived judicial overreach?
On the other side of the coin, Grace, the Trump administration has vowed to challenge the ruling. White House spokeswoman Abigail Jackson stated, quote, no federal judge has the authority to dictate immigration policy, end quote, and expressed an expectation that this, quote, gross overstep of judicial authority, end quote, would be corrected on appeal. U.S. Attorney Bill Asalee, representing the government, blasted the ruling, maintaining that agents act with proper legal justification. Trump's deputy chief of staff Stephen Miller called it, quote, another act of insurrection, end quote. DHS Assistant Secretary Tricia McLaughlin denied claims of racial targeting, stating operations are, quote, highly targeted, end quote, and Kristi Noem accused the judge of, quote, making up garbage, end quote. These strong reactions were reported by the Los Angeles Times, Anchorage Daily News, and Newsweek.com. Clearly, no love lost there.
Fascinating. So, Chloe, as of today, July 13th, 2025, what's the immediate impact of this temporary restraining order, and what's next?
Well, Grace, the temporary restraining order is in effect. It is a temporary measure set to expire in 14 days, which would be July 27, 2025. The coalition of plaintiffs will be seeking a preliminary injunction to make the order more permanent, with a hearing scheduled for July 24, 2025, which is just 11 days from today. Los Angeles City, County, and 7 other municipalities have also requested to join the lawsuit. Following the ruling, reports from BGOV.com indicated a halt to the immigration sweeps as of yesterday afternoon, July 12. It is worth noting this ruling also follows a previous preliminary injunction in April that had already barred U.S. Customs and Border Protection agents from making warrantless arrests in a large swath of eastern California, as reported by the Anchorage Daily News.
Chloe, this really delves into the complexities of constitutional law and immigration enforcement. Can you briefly explain the legal precedents for our viewers, especially around this concept of, quote, reasonable suspicion, end quote, in immigration cases?
It's a very complex area, Grace. Historically, the Supreme Court case, Terry v. Ohio in 1968, established the, quote, reasonable, articulable suspicion, end quote, standard for investigatory stops, which is less strict than probable cause. More directly for immigration, chairing United States v. Brignoni-Ponce in 1975, stated that Border Patrol stops near the border need, quote, reasonable suspicion, end quote, and crucially, it allowed Mexican appearance to be a, quote, relevant factor, end quote, though not the sole one. This led to the, quote, totality of the circumstances, end quote, test, where multiple factors could contribute. However, Judge Frimpong's current order directly challenges this, specifically prohibiting immigration agents from relying solely on factors like race, speaking with an accent, presence at certain locations, or a person's occupation, arguing they are, quote, no more indicative of illegal presence in the country than of legal presence, end quote. She's pushing for a much stricter interpretation to prevent discriminatory practices. This is a big deal, and if a future administration challenges this, they would likely argue that agents consider the, quote, totality of the circumstances, end quote, for effective enforcement, not just single factors.
Chloe, thank you for breaking down such a complex and critical story for us this morning. It certainly sounds like this legal battle is far from over.
My pleasure, Grace.
That was Chloe with the latest on the federal judge's order. We've been referencing reporting today from the Los Angeles Times, BBC News, Anchorage Daily News, BGOV.com, Oclusical.org, CBSNews.com, Newsweek.com, OWES.org, Justia.com, Cornell.edu, DHS.gov, ClinicLegal.org, PolicyExchange.org.uk, and AILA.org. Here are some other headlines. We begin this morning with a bit of a diplomatic deep freeze, as Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov issued a stern warning this past Saturday to the United States, South Korea, and Japan. He cautioned against them forging a security alliance aimed at North Korea, a message delivered during his visit to Pyongyang. Lavrov, who met with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un in the eastern port city of Wonsan, underscored Russia's opposition to what it perceives as military buildups by Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo, advising against exploiting ties to build alliances directed against North Korea, or indeed Russia itself. He also suggested that Russia understands North Korea's pursuit of nuclear weapons, viewing it as a response to perceived U.S. military threats. This warning comes on the heels of increased trilateral military exercises. Just last Friday, the US, South Korea, and Japan conducted joint air drills involving US nuclear-capable bombers near the Korean peninsula, where their top military commanders urged North Korea to cease all unlawful activities. Meanwhile, the bond between Russia and North Korea continues to strengthen, strategically, you might say. Pyongyang has been supplying ammunition and troops for Russia's conflict in Ukraine, reportedly in exchange for economic and military assistance. This arrangement has certainly raised eyebrows globally, especially concerning the potential transfer of sensitive military technologies that could, boost North Korea's nuclear and missile capabilities. Kim Jong-un reaffirmed Pyongyang's unconditional support for Russia, claiming both nations share identical views on all strategic issues. Lavrov, not to be outdone, called for further strengthening of their strategic and tactical cooperation. It seems the alliance has truly taken off. In unsettling news from South Africa, vital HIV vaccine research has been brought to a grinding halt, leaving scientists devastated and casting a dark shadow over global public health. This sudden cessation follows the United States' decision to pull foreign aid, a move that came just a week before crucial clinical trials for a promising HIV vaccine were set to begin. The Trump administration's dismantling of foreign aid programs, reportedly shifting focus to domestic priorities, and even linked to baseless claims about the targeting of the country's white Afrikaner minority, has had a profound impact. South Africa, which previously received around $400 million annually through USAID and the HIV-focused PEPFAR program, is now reeling. The Brilliant program, an HIV vaccine research project that had shown promising immune responses, lost $46 million in U.S. funding and has completely stopped. Another initiative, Matrix, focused on HIV prevention products for women, also saw its $125 million USAID funding over 5 years vanish. Financially, South Africa estimates a loss of about $107 million in U.S. research funding over the next half-decade, impacting not just HIV, but also critical tuberculosis research. The human cost is staggering. Approximately 100 researchers have been laid off, and at least 8,000 health workers in South Africa's HIV program have lost their jobs. Experts like Professor Glenda Gray, who heads the Brilliant program, highlight South Africa's crucial role, stating the country conducts trials better, faster, and cheaper than many global counterparts. The government admits replacing the lost U.S. support will be incredibly difficult, and UNAIDS is already expressing concerns over potential service disruptions and increased deaths. It seems a truly brilliant effort has hit a financial brick wall. Moving to Central Africa, a dire situation has unfolded in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, where rebels linked to the Islamic State group, known as the Allied Democratic Forces or ADF, tragically killed at least 66 civilians this past Saturday. The attacks, which the UN mission described as a bloodbath, took place in the Arumu area of Ituri province, bordering Uganda. The initial death toll of around 30 quickly escalated, with civil society groups confirming 66 victims, all reportedly killed with machetes, including women. The number of people taken hostage remains unknown, a chilling detail. Officials suspect this surge in violence is a direct retaliation for a recent bombing campaign against the ADF by joint Congolese and Ugandan forces, which began on Sunday. The ADF, a Ugandan Islamist group with ties to the Islamic State since 2019, operates across the porous border. While Eastern Congo had seen hopeful signs of an end to its conflict with the M23 rebel group, the ADF remains a formidable and brutal presence, continuing to wield terror across the region. Their attacks have intensified near Congo's border with Uganda and spread towards major cities like Goma and the neighboring Ituri province. Human rights organizations and the United Nations have consistently accused the ADF of killing hundreds and abducting many, including a significant number of children. This latest bloodshed shows that the conflict is far from chopped liver. Back here in the U.S., the Justice Department appears to be undergoing a significant internal shakeup, as additional lawyers and support staff who were involved in the prosecutions of former President Donald Trump have been fired. These terminations are part of a broader, months-long effort targeting personnel who worked on cases related to Trump and his allies. The recent firings specifically affect staff connected to Special Counsel Jack Smith's investigations into classified documents and election interference. While the exact number of individuals terminated remains unclear, reports suggest over 20 employees were let go this week, bringing the total to at least 35 Justice Department employees who worked for Smith, with potentially 15 more on the chopping block. Attorney General Pam Bondi herself signed some of the termination letters, including for Patty Hartman, a spokeswoman for the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington who handled Capitol riot cases. These actions reportedly stem from Bondi's Weaponization Working Group, established to review Biden administration law enforcement policies and investigate improper investigative tactics and unethical prosecutions. These latest dismissals follow earlier rounds in January and last month, when prosecutors involved in Trump and Capitol riot cases were also let go. Neither of Special Counsel Jack Smith's cases against Trump ever reached trial. The Supreme Court notably narrowed the election interference case, granting former presidents broad immunity for official acts, while a Trump-appointed judge dismissed the classified documents case, deeming Smith's appointment as special counsel illegal. Smith ultimately withdrew both cases in November 2024 after Trump's victory, citing a Justice Department legal opinion that protects sitting presidents from federal prosecution. According to a Justice Department official in January, the decision to fire prosecutors was because they could not be trusted to, quote, faithfully implement the president's agenda due to their significant role in prosecuting him, an action described as consistent with ending the weaponization of government. It seems the Justice Department is indeed clearing the bench. Finally, on Friday, July 11th, the United States government announced sanctions against Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel and other high-ranking officials. The reason? Their alleged involvement in human rights violations, a stark announcement made on the 4th anniversary of the significant anti-government protests that swept through Cuba in July 2021. This marks the first time the U.S. government has directly sanctioned Díaz-Canel. In addition to him, Cuban Defense Minister Álvaro López Miera and Interior Minister Lázaro Álvarez Casas have also been sanctioned, with their immediate family members now prohibited from traveling to the United States. Furthermore, the State Department will impose visa restrictions on unnamed Cuban judicial and prison officials, those deemed, quote, responsible for, or complicit in, the unjust detention and torture of the July 2021 protesters. The U.S. also added 11 hotels, including Havana's Torre K, to its Cuba prohibited accommodations list, a move designed to prevent U.S. dollars from flowing into the Cuban regime's repressive forces and to limit resources generated by international tourism. These sanctions are a direct response to the Cuban government's brutal crackdown on the July 2021 protests, the largest in decades, which were fueled by a severe economic crisis, including food shortages, high prices, and widespread blackouts. Human rights groups estimate over 1,000 arrests, with many still imprisoned after what they call summary trials. Accounts of physical abuse and torture suffered by detainees have also been documented. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio stated the U.S. will continue to stand for the human rights and fundamental freedoms of the people of Cuba, demanding immediate proof of life and the release of all political prisoners. However, Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez quickly slammed the sanctions as baseless and slanderous, stating the U.S. cannot bend the will of its people or its leaders. It seems the U.S. is trying to tighten the screws on Cuba. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King with Claude Sonnet 4.0, Gemini Pro 2.5, Gemini Flash 2.5, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.